They had been told that America was a decaying mongrel nation, weak and corrupt, where chaos reigned and the strong preyed upon the weak without order or purpose. They had been told that democracy was a disease that rotted societies from within, that freedom was merely another word for degeneracy, and that the mixing of races and cultures would inevitably lead to collapse. But when the train carrying 300 German officers pulled into Camp Concordia, Kansas, on a sweltering July afternoon in 1943, what they saw through the dust-streaked windows made them question everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The camp stretched across the prairie like a small city, its barbed wire almost invisible against the endless wheat fields that rolled toward the horizon. But it was not the vastness that made Lieutenant Colonel Hans Kruger press his face against the glass. It was the sight of German prisoners playing volleyball in the yard, their laughter carrying across the compound, while American guards sat in the shade reading newspapers, their rifles propped carelessly against the fence posts. In the Reich, guards beat prisoners for looking them in the eye. Here, the Americans seemed almost bored, as if guarding enemy officers was no more significant than watching cattle graze. The smell of beef cooking drifted through the windows as the train came to a stop, and Kruger's stomach clenched not from hunger but from confusion. Real beef. Not the sawdust bread and turnip soup they had been eating in North Africa before their capture. Not even the adequate but monotonous rations of the Wehrmacht at its peak. The scent was rich and full, carrying hints of onion and black pepper, and it came from the prisoners' mess hall. Their mess hall. The enemy was feeding them better than Germany had fed its own soldiers in years. As they filed off the train, the German officers maintained their rigid formation, back straight, boots clicking on the wooden platform despite the holes in the leather and the dust of 1,000 African miles. They expected to be processed like livestock, stripped, deloused, perhaps beaten to establish dominance. They had all heard stories of Soviet camps where German prisoners were worked to death in quarries, of British camps where rations were calculated to keep men just barely alive. Major Wilhelm Brenner, whose younger brother had died in a Soviet camp near Stalingrad, kept his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, preparing himself for whatever degradation awaited. But the American captain who greeted them was smoking a cigarette and seemed more interested in his clipboard than in asserting dominance. He spoke in accented but clear German, explaining that they would be assigned quarters, given clean uniforms, and expected at dinner at 1800 hours. Dinner. Not feeding time, not rations. Dinner. The captain mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they would elect their own spokesman, organize their own daily schedules within reason, and could request books from the camp library. Library. The word hung in the July heat like something from a dream. Captain Friedrich Richter, who had been captured after his panzer unit ran out of fuel in Tunisia, found himself assigned to a barracks with 19 other officers. The building was simple wood construction, nothing elaborate, but each man had his own bed with actual sheets, a footlocker, and a small shelf. On each bed lay a package containing soap, toothbrush, razor, towels, and this made Richter's hands tremble slightly as he picked up a carton of American cigarettes. Real tobacco, not the ersatz mixture of cabbage leaves and wood shavings that had passed for cigarettes in the final months of the Afrika Korps. That first evening in the mess hall shattered something fundamental in many of the men. They sat at actual tables with actual chairs, not benches, and were served by German prisoners who worked in the kitchen. Volunteers, they learned, who received extra privileges for their service. The meal was beef stew with fresh vegetables, white bread with butter, coffee with actual sugar, and apple pie for dessert. Apple pie. Oberst Klaus Müller, who had not seen butter in 2 years, spread it on his bread with the reverence of a man handling gold leaf. The butter was cold and sweet and tasted of cream, and when it melted on the warm bread, he had to close his eyes to keep from weeping. After dinner, they were free to walk the compound. Free to walk, no formations, no mandatory political lectures, no one screaming at them about duty and sacrifice and the glory of the struggle. The American guards were present but unobtrusive, and one of them, a sergeant from Missouri, even nodded at Richter and offered him a light for his cigarette. The sergeant's German was poor but enthusiastic, and he wanted to know if Richter had ever been to Munich because his grandparents were from there. A guard making conversation with a prisoner about family history. Richter's mind could not reconcile this with everything he had been taught about racial enemies and the inevitability of struggle between peoples. As weeks turned to months, the psychological impact of American abundance and freedom began to work on the German officers like water on stone. They received mail from home, censored but delivered with reasonable speed. They could write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. They were paid for their labor. Officers could volunteer for work, but were not required to perform it in canteen coupons that could be exchanged for cigarettes, candy, soap, and other small luxuries. Money. They were being paid money as prisoners of war. Major Brenner, who had been so prepared for brutality, found himself working in the camp library, cataloging books and helping to organize educational programs. The Americans had provided not just German books but textbooks, scientific journals, and even materials for men who wanted to learn trades. Brenner watched as fellow officers studied English, learned accounting, took correspondence courses from American universities that accepted German prisoners as students, even as the war raged on, even as American boys died on Italian beaches and in Pacific jungles fighting against Germany and its allies. The camp newspaper, written and edited by the prisoners themselves, was perhaps the most bewildering aspect of their captivity. They could write almost anything, not direct Nazi propaganda, but opinions, debates, even criticism of camp conditions. Lieutenant Heinrich Vogel, who had been editor of his university newspaper before the war, before such positions required party approval, and every word had to serve the state, found himself writing an article about the baseball games between prisoner teams. The Americans had taught them baseball, this bizarre sport with its incomprehensible rules and leisurely pace, and now German officers who had commanded tank divisions were arguing about batting averages and earned run averages with the passion they had once reserved for tactical doctrine. It was not the comfort that broke them, but the choices. Every day brought decisions that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, in the Reich, in the entire structure of their previous existence. What to read, what to study, whether to work or not to work, whom to befriend, what to think. Captain Richter found himself in the camp library one autumn afternoon, holding a copy of The Grapes of Wrath that someone had translated into German. In Germany, Steinbeck was banned, his works branded as communist propaganda. Here, Richter could read it openly, could discuss it with other officers, could even disagree with its premises without fear of denunciation. The cognitive dissonance grew stronger when they interacted with the American civilians who worked at the camp. The secretary in the administration office, Mrs. Anderson, brought homemade cookies every Friday and distributed them to whoever was there, prisoner or guard alike. Her son was fighting in Italy. She had shown them his picture. Proud but worried, yet she handed cookies to men who might have shot at him and smiled when they thanked her in broken English. When Oberst Müller asked her, through an interpreter, how she could be kind to enemies who might have killed her son, she looked puzzled and said, "But you boys didn't choose this war any more than my Tommy did. You boys didn't choose." The words echoed in Müller's mind for weeks. In the Wehrmacht, in the party, in every aspect of German life, they had been told that war was their destiny, their duty, their glory. Choice was weakness. Obedience was strength. But Mrs. Anderson, this American woman with flour under her fingernails and worry lines around her eyes, spoke of choice as if it were as natural as breathing. The winter of 1943 brought snow to Kansas, and with it came Christmas packages from the International Red Cross and from American church groups. Real coffee, chocolate, canned fruit, warm socks, playing cards, and small gifts that had been donated by people in towns nearby. People who knew that German POWs were held at Camp Concordia and had chosen to include them in their Christmas charity. Lieutenant Vogel opened a package to find a hand-knitted scarf with a note, "Merry Christmas, stay warm," from the Ladies' Auxiliary of First Methodist Church, Concordia. These people, These enemies were sending them Christmas gifts while German cities burned under Allied bombs. The moral certainty that had sustained many of the officers through years of war began to crack like ice in a spring thaw. If Americans could show such kindness to enemies, what did that say about everything they had been told about American barbarism? If democracy could produce such abundance that even prisoners ate better than German civilians, what did that say about the superiority of the totalitarian state? Some men resisted these doubts. They formed tight groups, maintained military discipline, and spoke of the camp's comfort as a form of insidious propaganda designed to weaken their resolve. But even these hardliners could not explain away what they saw with their own eyes. When a prisoner fell ill with appendicitis, he was taken to the camp hospital and operated on by an American surgeon who worked with the same care he would have shown an American soldier. When another prisoner's wife wrote that she and their children were starving in bombed-out Hamburg, the Red Cross arranged for food packages to be sent from the prisoner's own rations. Captain Richter began teaching mathematics to younger prisoners who wanted to finish their education. The classroom, they had actual classrooms, was warm and well lit, with real blackboards and chalk, textbooks and paper. Paper was so abundant that they could use it for note-taking, for letters, for drawing, without the careful hoarding that had become second nature in Germany. One of his students, barely 19, asked him one day if he thought they would be allowed to stay in America after the war. The question was treasonous, defeatist, the kind of thing that would have meant a court-martial 6 months ago. But Richter found himself honestly considering it. The camp's proximity to the town of Concordia led to strange encounters that further disturbed their understanding of the world. When prisoners worked on local farms, volunteer labor, always volunteer, they ate lunch with the farmers' families. Lieutenant Colonel Kruger found himself sitting at a kitchen table in a farmhouse, eating fried chicken and mashed potatoes while the farmer's wife asked him about his own family, his children, as if he were a neighbor helping with harvest rather than an enemy officer. The farmer, Mr. Peterson, spoke of his frustration with government crop prices and his hopes that his son would take over the farm after the war if the boy made it home from the Pacific. He spoke of these things openly, critically even, about his own government, in front of an enemy officer, without fear. Without fear. That was the element that the German officers found most disturbing and fascinating. Americans criticized Roosevelt in the newspapers that arrived at the camp. They argued about the war, about strategy, about politics, in public, in print, without looking over their shoulders. The camp guards complained about their officers, their pay, their food, openly and without consequence, beyond perhaps a sergeant telling them to quit bellyaching and get back to work. It was not the criticism itself, but the casual nature of it, the assumption that disagreement was natural and safe, that made the German officers realize how different their worlds were. Spring came to Kansas in 1944 with meadowlarks singing in the wheat fields and wildflowers blooming along the fence lines. The prisoners had planted vegetable gardens, and now they tended tomatoes and squash with the devotion of men who had found purpose in small things. Major Brenner had organized a camp orchestra that gave concerts on Sunday afternoons. They played Mozart and Beethoven, but also Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman, music that would have been forbidden as degenerate in Germany, but which here brought American guards and German prisoners together in shared appreciation. It was during one of these concerts that news arrived of the D-Day invasion. The American guards were excited but not triumphant, and there were no reprisals against the prisoners, no reduction in rations, no cancellation of privileges. Life in the camp continued as before, even as everyone understood that the war had taken a decisive turn. That evening, Captain Richter stood at the fence watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold and realized that he was not unhappy about the invasion's success. Somewhere in his transformation from Wehrmacht officer to prisoner of war, from true believer to doubter, he had begun to hope for an end to the war more than for a German victory. The fundamental realization that broke most of them came not in a moment of drama but in the accumulation of ordinary days. They were being treated not as representatives of an enemy ideology but as individual human beings. Their ranks were respected but not fetishized. Their dignity was preserved not through rigid hierarchy but through basic decency. They could grow as people, learn new things, think new thoughts, make new friends, all while technically being prisoners. The walls that held them were made of wire, but the walls that had confined their minds for years were simply gone. Lieutenant Vogel expressed it best in a letter to his sister that he knew would be censored, but wrote anyway. "We were told that we were warriors in a struggle for existence, that strength was everything, and weakness was death. But here I have learned that a nation can be strong enough to show mercy, wealthy enough to share with enemies, and confident enough to allow dissent. We were told that freedom was chaos, but I see now that it is choice that makes people human." As 1,944 turned to 1,945 and news from Germany grew darker, cities destroyed, armies retreating, the homeland invaded, the German officers at Camp Concordia faced a terrible recognition. The nation they had served, the ideology they had believed in, the future they had fought for, was not just losing the war, but had been wrong from the beginning. The evidence was not in propaganda or re-education lectures. The Americans rarely lectured them about politics, but in the daily reality of American life that they witnessed from behind wire fences. When farmers' daughters brought pies to the camp for Thanksgiving, when the local high school band gave a concert for the prisoners, when American guards shared news from home and asked about German cities with genuine concern for the prisoners' families, the officers could no longer maintain the fiction that Americans were culturally inferior enemies deserving of conquest. These were people who had built a society where abundance was so great that they could afford to be generous to enemies, where freedom was so secure that they could allow criticism, where strength was measured not in dominance but in decency. The final months before Germany's surrender were perhaps the hardest for the prisoners. They knew what was happening to their homeland, could read between the lines of letters from home that spoke of difficulties and challenges. They knew their families were suffering while they ate 3 meals a day and slept in warm beds. The guilt was crushing, but so was the knowledge that they were experiencing something their families might never know. What it felt like to live without fear of the state, to speak without watching for informers, to choose without permission. Oberst Müller kept a journal during those months, technically forbidden but overlooked by guards who understood the need to process such profound disorientation. In one entry, he wrote, "We came here as officers of the Wehrmacht, convinced of our superiority and the rightness of our cause. We will leave as men who have seen a different world, one where a farmer's son and a factory worker's daughter can question their leaders, where newspapers can mock the president, where enemies can become neighbors over coffee and conversation. We were not conquered by American arms, we were defeated by American freedom." When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the prisoners at Camp Concordia gathered in the mess hall to hear the announcement. There was no celebration among them, only a heavy silence followed by quiet weeping. They wept for their destroyed nation, for their dead comrades, for their suffering families. But some also wept for the years they had lost believing lies, for the crimes committed in their name, for the world they had tried to destroy without understanding what they were fighting against. The repatriation process began slowly. Many prisoners did not want to leave. They had heard rumors of what awaited them in Soviet-occupied zones, knew that their homeland was in ruins, understood that the skills they had learned and the thoughts they now carried would be dangerous in whatever Germany emerged from the ashes. Some applied to stay in America, though few were permitted. Others delayed their return as long as possible, volunteering for labor programs that kept them in the United States until 1946. Captain Richter was among the last to leave Camp Concordia. On his final day, he stood in the library where he had taught mathematics, where he had read forbidden books, where he had learned to think freely for the first time in his adult life. The shelves were still full. Waiting for the next occupants, there was talk of using the camp for displaced persons from Europe. He pulled out the copy of The Grapes of Wrath he had first read 2 years ago and opened it to a passage he had memorized. And the great owners, who must lose their land in an upheaval, the great owners with access to history, with eyes to read history and to know the great fact, when a property accumulates in too few hands, it is taken away. He understood now what the Americans had understood all along. that freedom was not chaos but choice, that democracy was not weakness but strength drawn from the consent of the governed, that treating enemies with dignity did not diminish the victor but elevated them. The 1,000 small kindnesses he had witnessed, the daily freedoms he had experienced, the individual choices he had been allowed to make, had taught him more about American power than any battlefield defeat could have. As the train pulled away from Camp Concordia for the last time, carrying the final group of German officers toward ships that would take them back to a homeland they barely recognized, Lieutenant Colonel Kruger watched the Kansas wheat fields roll by. The same fields he had seen from a different train 3 years ago, when he had been a prisoner newly captured, full of Nazi certainty and Wehrmacht pride. Now he was still technically a prisoner but felt freer than he ever had as an officer in what they had called the 1,000-year Reich that had lasted barely 12. The American guards on the train were relaxed, some playing cards with the prisoners, others sharing their lunch. One young corporal from Texas was trying to learn German phrases from Lieutenant Vogel, mangling the pronunciation so badly that even Kruger smiled. These Americans, with their easy confidence and casual kindness, their complaints about army food and their pride in their hometowns, their ability to see enemies as human beings worthy of decent treatment, had conquered not through superior force but through superior values. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners about their experiences in American camps, many would struggle to articulate what had changed them. It was not any single moment of revelation but the accumulated weight of daily freedom, the choice of what book to read, the decision to work or not work, the ability to express opinions without fear, the experience of being treated as individuals rather than representatives of an ideology. The recognition that their captors' strength came not from suppression of dissent but from confidence in their system's ability to withstand criticism. Major Brenner, who had returned to a devastated Munich and spent years helping to rebuild German democracy, would tell his students that he had learned more about governance in a Kansas prison camp than in all his years of German education. The Americans had taught by example what no lecture could have conveyed, that a society built on individual freedom and human dignity was not only more humane but ultimately more powerful than one built on obedience and racial mythology. The prisoners of Camp Concordia carried these lessons back to Germany, where they would help rebuild a nation on different principles. Some became teachers, sharing not just knowledge but the concept of critical thinking. Others entered business, bringing with them ideas about labor relations and management they had observed in America. A few entered politics, advocating for democracy with the passion of converts who had seen the alternative. But perhaps the most profound impact was on their families, their children, the next generation who grew up hearing stories not of American brutality but of American generosity, not of democratic chaos but of democratic choice, not of enemies but of people who had shown that even in war, humanity could prevail. These stories, told in quiet voices over dinner tables in Hamburg and Munich, in Cologne and Frankfurt, helped create a generation of Germans who would embrace democracy not as an imposed system but as a liberation. The wheat fields of Kansas still surround what was once Camp Concordia. The barracks are gone, the fences removed, the mess hall demolished. But in the soil where German prisoners once grew tomatoes and played baseball, where they learned English and debated philosophy, where they discovered that freedom was not something to fear but to cherish, seeds were planted that would bloom decades later in a rebuilt, democratic Germany. It was not the military defeat that transformed those German officers. It was the daily experience of American life, the 1,000 small freedoms, the casual kindnesses, the assumption that choice was a birthright and dissent was patriotic. They had arrived as enemies, indoctrinated in an ideology of racial superiority and authoritarian certainty. They left as men who had glimpsed a different possibility for human society, one where strength meant the confidence to show mercy and freedom meant the right to become who you truly were. The American guards who had watched over them, those farm boys from Missouri and factory workers from Detroit, probably never knew the profound impact of their ordinary decency. They were just doing their jobs, treating prisoners according to regulations and their own moral compasses, but in showing enemy officers that America's strength lay not in crushing dissent but in allowing it, not in forcing conformity but in celebrating choice, they won a victory more complete than any battlefield could achieve. Today, when historians study the transformation of post-war Germany from totalitarian state to stable democracy, they often focus on grand policies and famous leaders. But in the memories of men who spent years behind barbed wire in places like Camp Concordia, the transformation began with smaller things: a guard offering a cigarette, a secretary sharing cookies, a farmer's wife asking about their families, a library full of books they were free to read, a choice they were allowed to make. These German officers had been told that democracy was weakness, but they learned it was strength. They had been told that freedom was chaos, but they discovered it was choice. They had been told that Americans were soft and decadent, but they found them confident enough to be kind to enemies. In the end, it was not American weapons that defeated Nazi ideology in the minds of these men, but American values, lived out in the most ordinary ways by the most ordinary people, and there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.